Disclaimer: under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz came in on their own for their arraignments, but left in cuffs after Judge Mary Claire Akers set their bonds at $500,000, more than double what they had already paid.
And I don't think I've ever seen an indictment like this in all of my time. It alleges human trafficking, human rights violations, the use of forced labor, human rights violations specific to the fact that these children were targeted because of their race, and their use as basically slaves from what the indictment alleges, along with human trafficking and neglect with serious risk of bodily injury or death. I don't find the bond to be sufficient.
Whitefeather and Lantz were first arrested last October when a welfare check turned into the discovery of two teens apparently locked in a shed where investigators said they lived in deplorable conditions behind the Sissonville home. One other kid was found inside the house and two others were not home, all adopted by the couple. The indictment brought more than a dozen new charges against them alleging human trafficking and forced labor, also civil rights violations, as investigators believe they targeted these children specifically from a shelter because they were black, forcing them to work as slaves. Whitefeather and Lantz were originally in Washington State, and it is alleged they brought the children with them to Sissonville when they moved.
Counts 9 through 12 allege the use of forced labor, which I read as slavery.
Bond was initially set at $200,000 cash, and they were both able to post it. Prosecutors have said in a new complaint for forfeiture, the couple sold a $725,000 80-acre ranch in Washington State and sold their Sissonville home to post bond, and they believe both of these properties were paid for through trafficking. That will be decided in a separate court matter, but because of this, prosecutors say they found discrepancies in the financial affidavit Lantz filled out for a court-appointed attorney, leading to a new charge on his indictment.
Some of the information on his face is inaccurate.
Lantz had to fill out a new affidavit today as the two were taken back into custody. It's the prosecution's ultimate goal to seize the $400,000 that Whitefeather and Lantz posted for bond in February. The argument is that bonds were paid by selling homes in Washington State and in Sissonville, where human trafficking occurred. But what happened today is Kanawha County Chief Circuit Court Judge Mary Claire Akers signed a protective order for that money, meaning it must stay with the sheriff's office until the courts decide if it will be seized or not.
We're not trying to forfeit the money without due process. We just want to protect it and preserve it until we've had a chance to litigate the claim.
A 16-count indictment was recently returned against Lantz and Whitefeather, going far beyond their initial charge of child neglect. Investigators now say the couple sought out and adopted 5 black children from a shelter, targeting them for their race to do forced labor. The complaint said Lantz and Whitefeather first had them at this 80-acre ranch in Washington State and then moved to the Sissonville home. This is where deputies, while doing a welfare check last fall, found 2 teenagers locked in a barn in what investigators called deplorable conditions. After they were arrested, the 2 sold the Washington home for about $700,000 and the Sissonville home for about $300,000. Prosecutors believe they used that money for bond.
And the state's position is that these assets were used to maintain and harbor minors in violation of the human trafficking statute. Our position is that's not true, and we look forward to a court in which we can prove otherwise.
So for now, the money is supposed to remain untouched until the court proceedings play out. Whitefeather's defense attorney Mark Plants and Kanawha County Assistant Prosecutor Chris Kavaniak both said seeking forfeiture for human trafficking, though common in federal court, will be uncharted waters for all in circuit court.
I've never had one in 20 years. The human trafficking statute is relatively new. Chris Kavaniak's the prosecutor. He's formerly a federal prosecutor where they do this all the time. He's very competent, knows what he's doing. But this is an issue of first impression for me, and I think the court. I don't want to. You know, when I looked this up, I couldn't find anything about it, and you notice that Mr. Kavaniak said the same thing. That in state court, this really hasn't been done before.
In an unusual move for a bond hearing, Jeanne Whitefeather's new defense attorney, Mark Lantz, called a witness to the stand, Whitefeather's brother, to make the argument that the case where children were found locked in a barn in Sissonville has been misrepresented.
On its face, sounds atrocious. However, there are two sides to every story.
Whitefeather's brother, Mark Hughes, also from Washington State but recently moved to Chesapeake, Ohio, testified that on the phone, Whitefeather told him there was a key in the shed for the kids to let themselves out. A week and a half after Whitefeather and her husband were arrested, Hughes visited the shed and took these photos of the inside, including this one, showing a key on the table.
That is the key, exactly how we found it. And when I saw it, I went, holy crap, is that really the key to this door? And how could the police possibly have gone through this and not noticed this key 3 feet from the door?
Assistant prosecuting attorney Fawn Cushman asking a similar question, pointing out that it had been a week and a half after the arrest had been made that these photos had been taken, alleging there was no proof this key was there the day of the arrest.
I don't know how it got there.
And you have absolutely no idea the condition that the children were found in when the police arrived, because you weren't there.
I was not there at the time, but I've spent an awful lot of time around these children.
Hughes testified that the last time he saw the children was at the beginning of September. The children told deputies that being locked in the shed was an everyday thing. A neighbor who called 911 that day said she had witnessed them being locked inside that day and had raised several concerns prior about the children's well-being. The responding deputy recently testified that the conditions inside were repulsive, with a smell that made her eyes water.
If there was a key on the desk that allowed her to enter and exit the shed, then why were the police outside for 2 hours and had to force entry?
Lantz responded by arguing the possibility that children's statements to police were not credible and that they could have gotten out the whole time.
There's a key inside, and the 14 and 16 want their teenage clubhouse to go down there and play around. And a jury will make that decision. Thank you.
Judge Mary Claire Akers, however, siding with the state, arguing that Whitefeather, who moved here about a year ago from Washington State, was a flight risk, and if she owned a house valued at $375,000 with plans to move to Beckley, finances should not be a concern.
$200,000 cash is necessary. I understand what you're saying about the strengths and weaknesses of the case, Mr. Lantz, but I cannot ignore that these pictures were taken a week and a half afterwards.